So normally when you're trying to multiply two positive integers, right, anything that's above zero, you normally will take, you'll take two numbers, let's say, 3 times 2, right? You'll take 3 times 2, and what you do is you know that this is 6, but when you're actually taking 3 times 2, right, that's the same thing as adding 3 together twice, right? So you get 3 plus 3, and we know that 3 plus 3 gives you 6, right? Or if you take, maybe 2 times 7, right? That's the same thing as either taking 7 twice or writing two sevens, 2 times 2 times, or plus, excuse me, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2, right? That's 3, 6, 7, right? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and we know that that's 14. But let's say that you were given a problem that involved maybe a negative number, right? So instead of maybe like 2 times 7, right? Maybe let's say you had, let's say that you had 5. Let's say that you had 5, and then you had that multiplied by a negative 3. Okay. 5, and then you multiply that by negative 3. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I am not sure exactly what to do here, but you may remember that when you're multiplying something, you're still taking that number and you're going to multiply it or add it together that many times, right? So I can take this negative 3 here. I can take this negative 3 and I'm multiplying it by 5. That's the same thing as me taking negative 3 and adding it together 5 times, right? So we get 3 plus negative 3. Maybe I should put these in brackets. Negative 3, right? You do this 5 times like that, right? And when we're adding negatives, right? When you add a negative to a negative, right? You take negative 3, you add 3 more negatives, you have negative 6, and then that's negative 9, negative 12, and negative 15. Okay? Well, let's say that maybe you had two negatives. Let's say instead of 5 and negative 3, maybe say instead you had negative 5 and negative 3. Negative 5 times negative 3. Well, again, that's the same thing as taking a negative 3 and multiplying it through, right? But the issue is that you've got this negative 3 here, right? So we're not sure quite how to proceed. Do you take negative 5 and multiply and add it by itself 3 times, right? Do you do that? But then you have this negative 3 that looks like the opposite. So I'm going to let you in on a secret. There's a chart that you can make that helps you figure out what to do. Okay. There's a chart that you can make that helps you figure out what to do. Now, if both sides are the same, okay, so say you have a positive times a positive, right? So like a normal map multiplication problem, we have it up here. If the signs are the same, so you have two positives or two negatives, okay, your answer. So this is your input, and then your output or your answer, right? Your answer is always going to be positive. Okay. Now, if your answers are opposite, so say you had, or your answers, say your inputs are opposite, say you have a minus a negative number times a positive number, or you have a positive number times a negative number, your answer is always going to be negative, right? Your answer is always going to be negative. So in the case of this negative 5 times negative 3, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to take the absolute value of both numbers. So this negative 5 has an absolute value of 5. Okay. And then this negative 3 has an absolute value of 3. So I can rewrite this as 5 times 3 in my head, 5 times 3 in my head. And I know that 5 times 3 gives me 15. And because I started with the same sign, my answer, my output is actually going to be positive. So I'm left with this positive 15. Okay. And we can do the same thing if we had a negative answer or negative input and a positive input. Let's say that you had 6, and let's say that you had like a -7 or something, right? The absolute value of a positive 6 is just 6. The absolute value of -7 is 7. We know that 6 times 7 gives us 42. And because I had a positive times a negative, or the opposite signs, right, this actually will stay a negative. Okay, so 6 times a -7 should give us a -42. Okay, so when you're multiplying these kinds of numbers, you need to make sure that you're checking the sign. All right, you make sure that you're checking the sign. Let's try another one. So let's say that you had, maybe a negative. So you had maybe a negative, let's do -8. And we're going to multiply that by a -4. Okay. Well, I'm thinking in my head, well, I've got 8 times 4, which gives me 32. And then I'm starting with 2 negatives, so that creates a positive. Okay. Now you can do the same thing with more than one number. You don't have to just stay with, 2 numbers. You can do more than one number, right? So for example, let's say you wanted to do, let's do -6 times -2, and then times, let's say, a -1. Okay. Now you can think to yourself before you begin, how many negatives do I have? How many negatives and positives do I have? Right. So I'm seeing 3 negatives. All right. And because I know how this rule works, I know that I'm going to end up with a negative number. Okay, I'm going to show you why. So if I take -6 and -2 and I multiply those together, right? Again, I've got 6 times 2 is my absolute value. So that's a 12. And I started with 2 negatives. So that means my answer is going to end up as a positive. But I'm still left with this -1 that I'm going to multiply by. And because 12 times -1, right, means I have an opposite, I have positive and negative, my absolute value is still going to be 12, 12 times 1, but my sign is going to change to a -12. Okay. So you got to make sure that you're watching for those triple negatives. So if you have an even number of negatives, right? If you have an even number of negatives, you're going to have a positive number. If you have an odd number of negatives, you're going to have a negative number. Okay. Let's try one more. Let me use a different color here. Let's try one more. Let's do -33 times -2 times 2 times -1. Okay. And I encourage you to take a second and try this out for yourself. So assuming that you have, let's start with -33 and -2. Okay. So I have -33 times -2. Those are both negative. So I know my answer is going to turn out to be positive. And I know that 33 with another 33, if I add those two together, I get an answer of 66. I still have my 2 and I still have my -1. Okay. And then I'm going to just do 66 times 2. 66 times 2, right? You get 6 times 2, which is 12. Carry your 1, right? 2 times 6 gives me 12, plus that 1 is 13, 132, right? Times -1. And when I multiply by a -1, I just change the sign. So I get -132.